Hello, and welcome to the review of Procedure MG-O-004.01. Today, we will cover procedures related to the informed consent process and respective required documentation. Let's take a moment to address why this procedure is important to clinical research. The purpose of this procedure is to establish a consistent method for obtaining and documenting the informed consent process. It is important to note that when we are referring to the informed consent process, it is an ongoing process that begins with the initial informed consent when the investigator has identified the potential human subject and continues until the study participation concludes. As this is an ongoing process, recognize that the informed consent process is more than just having the subject's signature on the documentation. Informed consent is a key element of research with human subjects. As such, it is important to identify those who are responsible for the process's correct implementation. The scope of this procedure applies to those individuals and designated research staff first who obtain and document informed consent from living individuals involved in human subject research or their legally authorized representative. Non-exempt human subjects research where the Institutional Review Board has not granted a waiver of informed consent. And research activity administered by MedStar Health facilities, all affiliated and satellite locations, MedStar Georgetown University Hospital, and Georgetown University Medical Center, or MedStar Georgetown. Throughout this presentation, there are many important terms that will be utilized. Coercion, undue influence, and the informed consent process are three definitions in particular that require some special attention. Informed consent process is the process by which a subject voluntarily confirms willingness to participate in a particular trial after having been informed of all aspects of that trial that are relevant to the subject's decision to participate. The informed consent process is documented by means of a written, signed, and dated informed consent form. Coercion, according to the Office of Human Research Protections, is when an overt or implicit threat of harm is intentionally presented by one person to another in order to obtain compliance. For example, an investigator might tell a prospective subject that he or she will lose access to needed health services if he or she does not participate in the research. Undue influence, according to the Office of Human Research Protections, is when an offer of excessive or inappropriate reward or other overture in order to obtain compliance. For example, an investigator might promise their students extra credit if they participate in research, and that would be the only way students could receive extra credit. Additional terms that will not be defined in this training include legally authorized representative, principal investigator, research, human subject, impartial witness, institutional review board, and investigator. If you are unfamiliar with any of these terms, please take a moment to pause this video and visit the MedStar Georgetown glossary to obtain the definition of the unfamiliar terms. While all of these terms are important, we're going to take a few minutes to explain the informed consent process in more detail. Informed consent is an entire process that involves a series of steps to ensure subjects are properly protected. Informed consent involves all the following actions throughout the process. Providing a potential subject with adequate information to allow for an informed decision about participation in the clinical investigation. Facilitating the potential subject's comprehension or understanding of the information. Providing adequate opportunity for the potential subject to ask questions and consider whether to participate. Obtaining the potential subject's voluntary agreement to participate. Continuing to provide information as the clinical investigation progresses or as the subject or situation requires. There are two main points to keep in mind thus far. First, informed consent is not the single step of having a potential subject sign documentation to participate. The informed consent process is about supporting the concept of voluntary engagement with research. A subject must feel that they are making an autonomous decision to ensure there is proper willingness to participate. Within the informed consent process, there are several key elements that should be considered to ensure appropriate effectiveness. Time. To be effective, you must allow sufficient time for subjects to consider the information shared, ask questions, and answering of those questions. Don't rush the process. Conversation with a potential human subject. The investigator or other study staff who are conducting the informed consent interview and the subject should exchange information and discuss the contents of the informed consent document. Informed consent is a dialogue. Minimize coercion or undue influence. The conversation must occur under circumstances that minimize the possibility of coercion or undue influence. Some situations that could be considered coercive include performing informed consent on a patient that was rushed to the emergency room and is on sedatives. Another example would be to consider a professor doing survey research about sensitive and private topics who wishes to use their students as participants and who threatens to fail or penalize any student who does not complete the survey. In addition, statements that claim investigational test articles are safe or effective for the purpose for which they are being investigated are prohibited. Likewise, statements that inappropriately overstate the possibility of benefit should be avoided because they may unduly influence potential subjects. Finally, the information given to the subject, which could include information provided orally during the consent interview or written information in the consent form, must be in a language understandable to the potential subject or legally authorized representative. The language which is shared should consider the health literacy of the potential subject. Health literacy is the degree to which individuals have the capacity to obtain, process, and understand basic health information and services needed to make appropriate health decisions. In addition, there is no exculpatory language permitted throughout the informed consent process. Exculpatory language is language that waives or appears to waive any of his or her legal rights, or release or appear to release the investigator, the sponsor, or the institution and its agents from liability for negligence. Within the informed consent discussion and documentation, there are a minimum of 20 items included. Listed here are examples of some of these items. There is a statement that the trial involves research. The purpose of the trial is identified. The trial treatments and the probability for random assignment to each treatment is discussed. The trial procedures that are to be followed, including all invasive procedures, are listed. The subject's responsibilities are stated. All aspects of the trial that are experimental are listed. The reasonably foreseeable risks or inconveniences to the subject and, when applicable, to an embryo, fetus, or nursing infant are discussed. Reasonably expected benefits are discussed. Please note that when there is no intended clinical benefit to the subject should be notified. Any alternative procedures or courses of treatment that may be available to the subject, and their important potential benefits and risks should be discussed. There are many more components of the informed consent form, so be sure to check out the template provided by the Georgetown University IRB to create your informed consent form. If you would like more information, please reference the GU-MHRI 103 Investigation Manual for more detailed descriptions of required components. Informed consent is a key element of research with human subjects. As such, it is important to identify those who are responsible for the process's correct implementation. Both the principal investigator and study team have specific responsibilities in the informed consent procedure. The principal investigator does not have to personally conduct the consent process. However, The PI remains ultimately responsible for ensuring proper consent processes, even when delegating the task of obtaining informed consent to another individual knowledgeable about the research. The research staff to whom the responsibility is delegated must be qualified by education, training, and experience to perform the activity and knowledgeable about the research. They must also be able to address concerns the subject may have about the study and/or alternative procedures or courses of treatment. The research staff to whom the PI delegates responsibility for obtaining and documenting informed consent, such as clinical research coordinators or research nurse coordinators, must ensure this procedure is effectively implemented. Please note, the delegation of this task to a member of the study team must be documented. In the first part of this procedural review, we have introduced the purpose, scope, and some information about the procedure. We are now going to transition into discussing the mandatory informed consent procedures. There are several prerequisites that must be completed before the informed consent process can begin. Most importantly, there must be IRB approval. The informed consent process may not begin until the study has been approved by the IRB of record and the local IRB as applicable. The informed consent forms, including short forms and translated documents, must be approved by the IRB and stamped if stamping is the practice of the IRB of record. In fact, subject-facing documents, including study-specific recruitment materials, must be IRB approved before approaching potential subjects. In addition, the source of truth for the most recent approved informed consent is the IRB of record. Only members of the research team who are approved by the IRB and who are delegated consenting responsibility by the principal investigator documented on the delegation of authority log as applicable are permitted to consent patients for the research study. No study-related procedures are to be conducted prior to the informed consent, including study-specific screening procedures, unless, in rare cases, certain procedures are otherwise approved by the IRB prior to screening. When a full clinical protocol has been issued by the sponsor and MedStar Georgetown is the IRB of record, complete the site supplement to sponsor protocol form and upload it under the protocol section of the SMART form. The purpose of the supplement is to describe local procedures for obtaining informed consent where they differ from or are not addressed in the sponsor's protocol. The regulatory coordinator and/or research coordinator will upload to Encore the current version of the IRB-approved informed consent document for each institution participating in the study, following department processes. The consent form will be searchable using the document search in Encore. If a prolonged period of time elapses from the date of consent to the date of entry into the study, or an updated consent form is available, reconsent may be required by the sponsor. The research team must use the most current IRB-approved version of the consent form and a consent form relevant to the populations being enrolled. The research team should review and implement the specific consent requirements for the study as required by the sponsor, protocol, and/or IRB. There are important considerations in approaching potential subjects for study participation. The potential subject, or legally authorized representative, if appropriate, is provided with general information about the nature of the study and why they might be suited to participate. Recruitment flyers, websites, and telephone scripts may be a part of this process. Once you have fulfilled all the prerequisite requirements, you can move on to actively performing the informed consent process. As you can see in the figure, there are 5 recommended steps in the informed consent process. Let's go over each step of the process together. The first step of the informed consent process is the introduction. Conduct the informed consent process in a location that provides the best possible privacy. Encourage input from family and friends and/or other care providers if appropriate. Be prepared to accommodate potential research subjects with specific needs. For example, the potential subject may be hearing impaired or visually impaired. Differentiate between clinical care and research. Investigators who are clinicians should ensure separation of their clinical and research roles regarding interactions with potential research subjects. The research team should ensure the potential research subject understands that this is research and refusal to participate will not impact clinical care. Based on what we have learned about the informed consent process so far, can you identify the mistake in the image? Please pause the video to closely observe the image and identify the mistake in the informed consent process. If you guess the location is not appropriate for informed consent, you are correct. This area the clinical research coordinator is using to consent a potential subject is in a public setting. Remember, informed consent should be performed in a private, quiet place so the potential subject can ask questions in confidence. The second step of the informed consent process is explanation. When explaining the study to the potential subject, use plain language and non-technical terms. Consider the subject's reading level and primary language spoken. Please note, the Georgetown University IRB recommends that the 8th grade reading level for informed consent documentation be used. The investigator or delegated staff must explain all required elements of the informed consent. Pay particular attention to additional requirements that might necessitate additional explanation, such as avoidance of pregnancy during study participation, genetic testing, or use of data or biological samples for future research. In addition, per study requirements, certain elements of the informed consent must be discussed with clinical staff, such as a clinical nurse, attending involved in the research study, or those qualified by education and training. The third step of the informed consent process is comprehension. You must verify and document the potential subject's understanding of the study and their responsibilities of participation. In order to gauge comprehension, use the teach-back method. In this method, comprehension is checked, not memory. We will explore this in a subsequent slide. If concern exists regarding comprehension after asking such questions, consider engagement of an advocate and the PI. Competency evaluation may be required by the protocol and/or sponsor. Competency evaluations may be required by the protocol and/or sponsor for certain populations or as needed based on comprehension assessment. In the teach-back method, the potential subject will explain their health information in their own words. There are 3 steps for performing the teach-back method. The first step is the explain step. In the first step, the study team member explains information to the patient in plain language, using clear and concise terms. This is considered the explanation part of the informed consent process. The second step is the assess step. In this step, the study team member asks the subject to explain in their own words their understanding of different parts of the informed consent form. Some sample questions you could ask the subject include, I want to make sure we have the same understanding about this research. Can you tell me what this project is about in your own words? What do you expect to gain by taking part in this research? What risks would you be taking if you joined this study? Will anything happen to you if you refuse to be in this study? What would happen to information already gathered if you change your mind? Who will be able to see the information that you give us? And what should you do if you have any questions or concern about the study? The final step is the confirm or clarify step. In this step, the study team member will determine the level of subject understanding. If the subject is having trouble answering the question, then the study team member will clarify the information and go back to the explain step to begin the process again until the subject can demonstrate understanding. With the teach back method, consider employing the chunk and check strategy. There's only one small modification when employing the chunk and check. In the first step, the study team member explains information from a small part of the informed consent document instead of the informed consent document as a whole. The second step is the assess step. In this step, the study team member asks the subject to explain, in their own words, their understanding of the discussed part of the informed consent form. The final step is the confirm or clarify step. In this step, the study team member will determine the level of subject understanding. If the subject is having trouble answering questions, then the study team member will clarify the information and go back to the explain step to begin the process again until the subject can demonstrate understanding. If the subject understands the portion discussed, the study team member will repeat the process for the next portion, or chunk, of the informed consent form. In summary, the study team member explains a chunk, checks for understanding, and repeats with another chunk. This process may be more time-consuming, but presenting information to the subject in a smaller portion invites more focused questions, a less intimidating environment, and improved comprehension for the subject. The fourth step of the informed consent process are questions and answers. Provide ample opportunity for the investigator or designee and the potential research subject to exchange information and ask questions, including time to take the information home to discuss with a trusted advisor. Ask open-ended questions such as, "What questions do you have for me?" or "What would you like to hear more about?" Repeat any information where you believe there may be gaps in understanding or any areas of confusion. We have now reached the final stage in the informed consent process, which is obtaining consent. Allow the potential subject adequate time and privacy to read the informed consent and consider their options. Obtain the subject's voluntary written agreement to participate by ensuring the subject's consent is free from coercion or other undue influence. Make sure the subject is competent and aware what he or she is doing, and subjects should not be under the influence of alcohol, illicit drugs, or prescribed medications that impair understanding or judgment. The authorized person conducting the consent process will review the consent to ensure there is proper completions of signatures, initials, and dates. However, the investigator is ultimately responsible for ensuring the process is conducted properly. When all of the steps of the informed consent process have been completed, we can then move to consent signing and documentation. In order to ensure consent signing and documentation is done correctly and completely, the following steps must be considered. The consent forms must be signed and dated by the subject or LAR as appropriate, the person obtaining consent, and witness if requested by the IRB or sponsor. Ensure that the signatory signs and dates each required signature line in the consent. A signed copy of the consent form, as well as other documentation about the research, such as calendars or instructions, must be provided to the subject and/or LAR as appropriate. An original or certified copy of the entire signed consent form must be retained in the study records. The research staff performing the informed consent process must document that the process has occurred in the electronic health record or use a narrative consent note, which should be filed together with the consent form in the study binder. The following information should be included: date of consent discussion, who was present during the informed consent discussion, study identification, notation regarding to whom copies of the document were given, contact for study, and notation that consent was obtained prior to performing any study-related procedure unless otherwise approved by the IRB. The guideline titled MG-O-004.01 Using MedConnect Autotext and Power Forms for Research Documentation provides a template for documenting the informed consent process in the electronic health record. The same text can be used for a narrative note. Informed consent documentation should be connected to the subject's electronic health record. The signed informed consent form should be uploaded to MedConnect or any other electronic health record as required by the Joint Commission. A copy of the signed informed consent must be uploaded in the subject's medical record in MedConnect in the Clinical Trials Off folder in MedConnect Clinical Documents. If you would like additional guidance on how to upload informed consent to MedConnect, please refer to the respective job aid. There are exceptions to uploading the consent to MedConnect. The first exception is university-conducted research outside MedStar Health facilities. The second exception is if the studies are deemed sensitive or stigmatizing, such as behavioral health studies or addiction studies. Seen here is a copy of the job aid on how to upload the signed informed consent forms to MedConnect. This document can be found in the Procedures Appendix for your closer perusal. In summary, the informed consent process has 5 key steps: introduction, explanation, comprehension, question and answer, and obtaining consent. In order to ensure the potential subject truly understands and is voluntarily participating in a study, following these steps is crucial. Remember that this informed consent process must be performed every time a subject is approached with new information about a study. Subjects must have the opportunity to make the decision about whether to continue in the study if there are changes. The steps of the process ensure the subject is still voluntarily engaging in the study. Reconsenting, if there is a new version of the informed consent form, may be required. Reconsenting will be discussed in Procedure MG-O-004. Now that we have discussed the informed consent procedure, we are going to transition into additional considerations during the informed consent process. An impartial witness is a person who is independent of the trial, who cannot be unfairly influenced by people involved with the trial, who attends the informed consent process if the subject or the subject's legally acceptable representative cannot read, and who reads the informed consent form and any other written information supplied to the subject. If an impartial witness signature is required by the IRB or sponsor, the witness should be present during the entire informed consent discussion process to prevent undue influence during the process and to ensure the patient signed the consent form. Mistakes happen in studies. Luckily, there are guidelines for how to fix those errors. If an error is made in the documentation of informed consent, the individual making the error must draw a single line through the error, initial and date, and then enter the correct information beside the error. Research team members should not correct text entered by the subject. If an error is made by the subject, such as writing the wrong date, the research team should ask the subject to strike through the text, enter the correct text, initial, and date. If the error is not caught while the subject is still present, they can correct at the next visit. If the error is not caught while the subject is still present and the subject will not be returning, then the research team member should generate a note to file explaining the error with reference to supporting documentation. In summary, IRB approval is required before engaging potential subjects in the informed consent process. The informed consent process is not a single-step informed consent form signature. Informed consent is a process. There are 5 steps in the informed consent process: introduction, explanation, comprehension, question and answer, and consent. Completing each step thoroughly is important to ensuring potential subject autonomy. Throughout this video, guidance was provided for how to interact and engage subjects, such as comprehension checks using the teach-back method. Finally, consent signing and documentation requirements were discussed. This concludes the overview of Procedure MG-O-004.01 on informed consent and documentation. If you would like more information on Joint GU-MHRI procedures, please visit the website shared on the screen or visit MedStar Starport. Take care.